Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Welcome to today's episode where I interviewed Michael Michalko. Michael is one of the world's foremost leading experts on creative thinking. I have a deep passion in creative thinking myself, having read some of the best authors on this topic since the early 1990s. Michael's material is amazing. I read both of his books, Thinker Toys and Creative Thinkering, that were just deep treasure troves of information on how to expand my creative thinking. And Michael, early in his career as a U.S. Army officer, was asked to organize a team of NATO intelligence specialists and international academics to catalog and collect and research all known inventive thinking methods known to mankind at that point. Pretty amazing project. And after the military, he was asked to lead CIA think tanks. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies and continues today to work with the special operations community as they respond to fast-moving, evolving threats around the world. So if you think that creative thinking is only meant for the certain few, for the Einsteins, the Edisons, the Michelangelos of the world, be prepared to have this myth debunked by Michael. It's a very fun, story-packed interview with Michael, and I hope you enjoy the show. So I really appreciate you for coming on and talking to myself and our listeners.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I am super passionate about this field of creativity, as you and I have been talking about prior to the show beginning. And I'd love to hear, your material is so dense, and I can read it from front to back, middle to front. I can open a page and it's one of those books where you don't have to read it in a linear fashion. You can go anywhere and get really good material from it. And I'd love to find out how you got started in this field of creativity.
It was serendipity. I was in the military, and I was assigned to be the liaison officer between 7th Army and NATO. I was a second lieutenant. And I went and I attended all these high-level meetings. And one night I'm at the officers' club sitting at the bar having a drink. This general came over and sat down next to me. And he said, "You know, young man, for a kid your age, a young lieutenant, it's got to be really exciting for you to sit in on these meetings and listening to these great minds talk about solutions to military and political and economic problems in Europe." And I said, "No, sir, it's not." Because I had no interest in making the military my career. I, at times, was brutally honest. And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And I said, "Sir, there's no original thinking going on. These people are simply reproducing what they have learned in West Point or other military schools, or what they have learned from somebody else. Whenever you ask a question, I can see them thinking, what have I learned from somebody else? What do the experts think about this? What do the specialists say?" There's no thinking at all going on. They're like Xerox copy machines, just remembering something that they have learned and reproducing it. And he goes, "Okay, smart ass." He said, "You facilitate the meeting next month." So I went out and I got this book called Applied Imagination by Alex Osborne. He was an advertising executive in Buffalo, but he's the man who pioneered brainstorming. Brainstorming came from Osborne's work. So I read his book about how to conduct a brainstorming session, and I conducted the meeting, and we came up with all kinds of great ideas. And the general said to me afterwards, "Son, this is your permanent position to conduct these think tanks for 7th Army and for NATO." And then I put together a team And this team collected all known inventive thinking techniques that were available at that time. And we wrote them and revised them. And we started running creative thinking sessions, for the military and then eventually for the CIA as well. And that's how it got started, by being honest, telling the general what I thought.
That's a fascinating story, and you couldn't think of a deeper bureaucracy than the Army. So it's
it's incredible, because I know that's the picture that people have of the Army, but in the military, you've got special operations, you've got special forces, you've got these elite units that are incredibly creative. Once I was assigned to this one unit, and my mission was to take a patrol out and locate the enemy. Well, we were out for about 10 days, came back. I reported to the colonel. I said, "Sir, we failed. We couldn't find the enemy." And he said, "What the hell are you talking about, failed? You never fail. You found out where the enemy was not." And they planned a whole offensive around this information, which was incredibly successful. That's when I learned that a lot of what I know and learned about creativity is never taught in school. There's no such thing as failure. Whenever you try to do something, you produce a result. It's what you do with that result that counts. Have you learned something you didn't know before? Have you discovered something you hadn't known? Can you explain something that you couldn't explain before? It's trial and error. And in school, I remember I was on, the mantra always was, don't make a mistake, don't fail. And that's when I got rid of that notion of there is no such thing as failure in the military. And then I would see these special forces units, whenever they were given a mission, it could be, go to the moon. I want you guys on the moon at the end of the week. Well, you never heard these guys complain, we don't have the time, we don't have the information, we don't have the expertise, we can't do it. Whatever the mission was, they would try and figure out how to do it. And, many times they succeeded and many times they didn't. But it was that can-do spirit that I saw in special operations and special forces and the Navy SEALs that really got me excited, too, about creative thinking. I think it's the natural way we're born to think. I believe we're all born as spontaneous, creative thinkers. And then we go to school. And in school, we're taught to be productive, logical, linear, exclusive thinkers. And then our mission seems to be in life to exclude possibilities instead of including possibilities. And then we end up graduating as a period, even though we entered school as a question mark. I remember, a teacher would get up and say, Einstein created this theory of relativity. I'd raise my hand. How did he get the idea? Oh, Einstein, he's a superior intellect. It's genetic. He's a blessed individual. Da Vinci, Edison, Einstein, these are specially blessed people because of their genes or genetics. They're intellectually superior. How did he get the idea, though? Well, that's not important, because we'll never get those kinds of ideas. That kind of education, which actually kills creativity.
I love reading your book because you kind of debunk the myth that these extra creative people are somehow superhuman. And what is it? And the piece that you mentioned is how. Like, you broke down the reasons, the ways how. Why is Leonardo da Vinci so important to study from your point of view on how? And what are some things that he did that could be applied today that you find are still important to learn from him?
Well, Leonardo da Vinci was the son of a single mother, so he was not allowed to go to university at that time. You were just not allowed to go to university if you didn't have two parents. So he was self-taught. He taught himself everything. And because he was self-taught, he did not pigeonhole or define information into disciplines. To him, there was no such thing as biology or religion or military as being separate domains. To him, it was all simply knowledge. And because he was able to cross-fertilize the ideas from one domain to another, he found creative thinking to be a simple operation, and he discovered that it's not possible for the human mind to think of two objects, no matter how dissimilar they are, without connections being formed. And one of his techniques was to pick up a sponge that was filled with paint and just throw it against the wall. And then he would look at the figures that the splotches made. And one day he's looking at the figures and he said, that looks like a horse. Looks like a horse on wheels. A horse on wheels. They started thinking, and then he drew a little picture of a horse on wheels. And then he said, I can make a mode of transportation out of this, and sketched the bicycle. Now, when he came up with an idea, he knew that it was the way you looked at the idea that determined the value of the idea. So you would look at things using multiple perspectives, because he wrote that the first perspective you use when confronted with a problem is based on your usual way of thinking. That will bring you along your usual thinking about problems, a conventional way of thinking about problems. So he looked at it from the viewpoint of the inventor himself, and he looked at it from the viewpoint of the man he was going to get the money from to invest in his invention. Then he looked at it from the viewpoint of the consumer, the man who would buy the bicycle, and then from the viewpoint of the municipality, the people who would have to govern the roads and, bicycles as they're being used in transit. And these were all things that he was self-taught. And the other thing he learned was that words are very imprecise when it comes to creative thinking. So he sketched and diagrammed his ideas, and he would only use words to communicate his ideas to other people. And it was the visual representation of information that he started that exploded in the Renaissance. And that's why the creativity in the Renaissance, became this big explosion of new ideas and new ways to do things, because people were now thinking not only verbally, but they were thinking visually as well. And a lot of creative thinkers have adopted that habit. Richard Feynman won the Nobel Prize in physics. His Feynman diagrams that he made for quantum physics won him the Nobel Prize. He came up with a way to visualize what was going on that could not be verbalized, to make it clear.
Yeah, that's, as I've studied through the years, I've loved the drawing and picturing, and I think it's fantastic, and it really spurs my own imagination. And
I was thinking, it's amazing when you read how these creative geniuses actually came up with their ideas, how easy creative thinking really is. Like when Da Vinci discovered that it's impossible to think of two things, no matter how dissimilar, without connections being formed. One day he's thinking about sound. How does sound travel? He's throwing pebbles into a pond, and he's watching the ripples emanate from where the pebble went in the pond. And in the distance, he hears a church bell. Now he's thinking about a church bell, ripples in a pond, and suddenly he gets his insight. Sound travels in waves.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. Now, if he had gone to school, he would have been taught there's no connection between the ringing of a church bell, throwing pebbles in a pond, and sound. They're all separate categories. And that's what we are taught to do. We're taught to think of life as a series of objects. Some are related, most are not. And when you're thinking about problems, only consider things that are related, and don't consider anything at all that's not immediately related to your subject.
This is where I think I've been stuck recently, I think, and as well as some of my listeners. And I'm going to give you an example, and then I did an experiment with my son last night. Right. We were driving to basketball practice, and I'd love for you to comment to my current challenge and then how I was teaching him about conceptual blending. So your concept of conceptual blending as a result to taking two dissimilar topics and blending them for new ideas. Because in my business, which I've been running for 15 years or so now, there's a set of knowns and I'm continually trying to bring the unknown in, but I think I get sucked into the habit of still not being able to expand the sphere of possibilities of solution sets. However, when I was explaining to my son, who's 11, he's very open to these ideas, but I said to him, well, I learned about conceptual blending today. And he goes, well, what's that? And I said, well, let's think we're going to have a new idea on, we have this big Doberman dog. So I was like, what if we took Thunder's dog collar and wanted to come up with a new dog collar, something different? And so we had to come up with it. So let's have dog collar plus another concept. And then immediately his brain went, well, what about a bandana? Like the Tonto, or maybe it was the Lone Ranger wore the bandana. And I said, okay, well, let's carry that forward then. And he goes, well, what about a ninja that is secretive wearing something on their head? And maybe instead of a dog collar, we could have like a GPS like dog collar. And then, and I'm not even teaching him. He's just like going from one thing to the next. And then he went to another item with a saddle, like a saddle contraption on the dog. So what's going on there from this concept of conceptual blending?
This is an example of how we're all born to think. You give a preschooler a box, and that preschooler will make that box into a billion different things. They'll make it into, it's a school, a desk, a book. They'll draw a picture on it, make it into a person. And after they go to school and are graduated, you give them a box and they'll say, this is to contain things, that's all. You know, they no longer look for alternatives. And your son was just explaining the way creative thinkers have retained that ability to think that way. And that's why most of them have done poorly in school. Thomas Edison had said his greatest blessing in life was the lack of a formal education, because he said had he gone to school, he would have discovered what he did was not possible to do. Einstein, his parents were told that he was mentally disabled when he was in elementary school, and he was expelled from elementary school because he was a negative influence. Then eventually, he applied to university, and he failed the university entrance test, had to go to trade school for a year, came back, was accepted in university, and never went to class, seldom went to class. His roommate kept good notes. He would simply memorize the notes, take the test, and pass. Now, on graduation, he was the only member of his graduating class who was not recommended for a teaching position. Everybody else was, except Einstein. One professor called him the laziest, dumbest dog we ever had. The only job he could get was this low-level job as a clerk in a government patent office, where he had to work 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. And while he's working there, with what time he had left, he comes up with a theory that changes the way we think about the universe. A man, the laziest, dumbest dog they ever had.
You spend a lot of time talking about attitudes and beliefs in the book. Not so much thinking toys, but the creative thinking. And I found it fascinating, but you had a different way of talking about it, and that was very different. And do you think that we lose our belief? Is it an attitude or a belief that you're making the point of? Because if SEALs are creative and they have an attitude of always going and trying to figure out a challenge, can that belief, that can-do spirit, is that a belief that can be carried over into...
You know, when I think about the can-do spirit, you know, you hear all the stories about the American dream and people who achieved the impossible. But those people, they lived before media, before TV, before World War II. After World War II, the mass media and psychology became paramount, And people stopped interpreting their own experiences. All experiences are neutral. They have no meaning. It's how you interpret things that give it the meaning. For example, I'm walking down the street and a girl bumps into me. I could say she's an aggressive feminist who did that deliberately. Or I could say, I'm getting older and I should be more careful how I walk. Or I could say, the architect has poorly designed the sidewalks for the amount of traffic it has. Or I could say, I think she's flirting with me. I give it the meaning. Now, one time, again, before psychologists and psychiatrists and the talking heads on TV interpreted things for people, people interpreted their own experiences. Abraham Lincoln, his father treated him like a work animal, farm animal. His mother showed him no affection at all. They wouldn't even buy him clothes that fit. They gave him clothes they got from other people. They were way too small for Lincoln. So at school, his classmates called him Gorilla Boy and Monkey Boy, all these names, and laughed at him. After he left school, he started a business and went bankrupt. Then he fell in love with this girl whose family would not let her date Lincoln because he was of a lower social class. And he runs for office and he fails. He runs for office, fails again. He ran for office 26 times for Congress and failed 26 times. Starts another business, goes bankrupt, has a nervous breakdown. Then he marries this woman who turns out to be emotionally unstable. He finally gets elected to Congress, but he's not reelected in his next election. Then he becomes president of the United States. And at the end of his tenure, this journalist said, Mr. Lincoln, you are this incredibly strong person. Where did you get this incredible strength from? And Lincoln said, adversity. Adversity. You must welcome all the adversity you can in life, because it is by overcoming adversity do you become the person you can become. Interpretation, how you interpreted what was happening to him. Now, you can imagine what a psychiatrist would have told him. Hey, you have no chance, you're a victim. You're abused as a kid. You have no education. You're obviously not fit for politics. What you should do is go out and get a job or get some government benefit to take care of you. And I think a lot of people have forgotten how to interpret their own experiences for themselves. Whenever something happens in the world, you don't even have to turn on TV anymore. Like, I can tell you what MSNBC will say about something, and I can tell you what Fox will say about something. Their interpretations are totally different. But people believe that that is somehow superior to their own interpretation of events, which is what has destroyed, in my opinion, what used to make America great.
So an individual that is trying to accomplish something meaningful, either within their business as an entrepreneur or as a IT leader
Right.
in a business, what you're saying is that if they're experiencing pressure or experiencing resistance,
It's their interpretation.
it's their interpretation that it is resistance because of
Right.
a filter that they might be applying
Yeah.
from an earlier experience
Yeah.
that they had.
You look at nature, there's the emperor moth, one of the most beautiful insects on Earth. And you have a cocoon with a baby emperor moth inside. The moth will start to chip away at the cocoon to free itself. And it takes forever for it to get free. It struggles and struggles and struggles. Now, if you start feeling sorry for the moth and take a knife or pair of scissors and make the opening larger so the moth can escape the cocoon, the moth will leave the cocoon and will never fly, because the struggle is what would push the fluid in the body out of the body as it came through the very narrow hole. By making it easy, you made it impossible for the emperor moth to live. And I think, there's a parallel between that and what happens with civilization. Once you make it easy for people, remove struggles, they lose the incentive to make their own lives.
Well, I think this is an amazing concept that you're bringing up, because I would say we're addicted to comfort. And I think that the process of being a top leader from the point of view of an entrepreneur or from the point of view of just a senior executive within a company,
right.
I think sometimes that we're approaching solving problems by what can give me the most comfort.
Sure. Yeah.
Versus what is the problem we're trying to solve? And maybe comfort is just something we're bringing forward that we think that we are top executives, so that we need to feel comfortable. But as you're saying, as a part of the growth, maybe this process is necessary to reach the higher levels that we're trying to reach.
Right. And, my experience with corporations when I came out of the service was, I was absolutely amazed at what I came across in terms of lack of initiative and the fear of new ideas, fear of innovation. I went to Kodak. I was consulting with Kodak, and I discovered that Kodak had invented digital photography, and they had all these patents. And I said, what happened here? They said, all the people who created this stuff, they all left the company to go out and work for themselves or other companies or smaller companies, because top management would not listen to them. Top management would say, we make our money with film. We have always made our money with film. And we're doing quite well making money with film. We are staying with film, and we are not going to start looking at other markets and other products that are different from what we have. So Kodak now is bankrupt.
Yeah.
And thousands of people who work for Kodak. Kodak used to be a great company to work for. They had great bonuses, vacation time, benefits. Now, these people are unemployed because of that thinking. And, part of my thinking at that time was these CEOs and top managers, their primary interest seems to be their own personal wealth. How much money can I make? What are the bonuses? How much can I make on my stock? And they think short term. I'm only going to be here for 5 years. I don't care what happens after that. It's like our politicians. I'm president of the United States. I'm spending money like crazy, but I'm only going to be here for a little while. I don't care what happens to the country after that. It won't be my fault. That kind of thinking. So I can see, UNIVAC invented the computer for science, and they refused to even talk to anybody who said, let's see if there are business applications, because they said it was invented for scientists. There are no business applications. And along comes IBM. And IBM then hires the most respected, expensive market research firm in the world to go out and see if there's a market for personal computers. They come back and say, there are no more than 6 people on Earth that have need for a personal computer. Then along comes Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Steve Jobs invents the personal computing. He goes to Hewlett-Packard, and he said, hey, here's our invention. Steve and I, Wozniak and I, invented this thing. All we want is a paycheck and the opportunity to work on our invention. And they said, Steve, you don't even have a college degree. You dropped out of college. Go back to college and learn computer science, learn about the technology, then come back, and then we'll talk about a job. He went to Atari. Atari told him the same thing. So Wozniak and Jobs with $600 to start Apple Computer. It's the way with innovation in industry. Chester Carlson invented xerography in 1938. Every major corporation refused to even talk to him about it because they said, who the hell is going to buy a copy machine when carbon paper is so cheap and plentiful. You know, it's absolutely amazing. Robert Goddard, who came up with liquid-fueled rocketry, he was mocked by every scientist and newspaper in this country. The New York Times said he seems to lack even a high school understanding of chemistry before he changed the world of rocketry with his ideas. You know, I'm just amazed that that seems to be the most creativity and innovation comes from the individual or the small entrepreneur, the risk taker, the person who is energized by creating ideas, looking for markets where none existed before. And then once the business takes off and becomes kind of an empire, the professional, educated people with their MBAs and doctorates come in and take it over and run it into the ground.
So an entrepreneur or an executive now that is interested in really innovating what they're doing, how could they craft their ideal day? And what I mean by that is the speed of information that's flowing right now and the speed of distraction is very high and it's very tempting. Is there a way that someone could structure their day such that, do they need to wake up earlier in the morning and then set up a specific time to start working on ideas? Is there specific things that they can do?
That problem has been around forever. You know, people will say, I've got too much to do, or I've got too much information, or there's no time. But when you look at people who actually do things, they find the time. Henry Ford worked on his Model T in his personal garage every weekend. They find the time to do it. Think of World War II, Winston Churchill, when England was at such peril, when he was out looking for ideas as to how the hell to survive, the country to survive. He had no time to do anything, but he made time to come to the United States and campaign to get Roosevelt involved in the war. Again, it's the way you interpret your experiences. Einstein working at night on his theory of relativity because he was passionately involved. And one thing that all creative geniuses have in common, too, is persistence and passion in what they do. And that's why they create prodigious quantities of ideas. And most of the ideas they create, by the way, are bad. There are more bad poems written by the major poets than by the minor poets, simply because people who achieve great things in the creative field produce an incredible number of more ideas than the average person. Michelangelo was asked what the secret to his success was, and he said, people think I'm a god. He said, I'm not a god. I'm simply more willing to work harder than anybody else at what I do. Van Gogh said the same thing when he was told he couldn't be an artist when he was in his 20s after he left the ministry. And he said, I'll become an artist because I will work harder than anybody else in the field. You become what you pretend to be. And once you start going through the motions of trying to come up with ideas, it becomes easier and easier as you do it. In Tibet, you have these novice monks who are spinning these dishes on top of reeds, and the idea is they're spinning prayers into divine space. Now, these novice monks at first are thinking, I don't know if I want to be a monk. Maybe I want to be a soldier. Maybe I want to have a family. I don't know, maybe I should get in government. I don't know if I want this religious life or not. But by spinning that dish, they become monks. It's going through the motions. And one way to avoid going through the motions of coming up with ideas is looking for ways not to do it. And one common way is to default. Let's say I don't have the time, because this makes it easy for people not to try to come up with new ideas.
Now, so there was a gentleman that I knew from when I was getting my black belt in Taekwondo. This is about 15 years ago. And he and I were friendly. He was a business owner as well. And he has sold his company for $350 million. And I had lunch with him one time and I said, what did you do? I said, how did you get to this point? And he said, well, and I had to kind of pry him a little bit in this, but he said, because I cannot stand group thinking sessions. He says, so I go into my basement and I go into a quiet space, and he goes, I sketch and I draw. And basically what he did is he disrupted Raytheon and Lockheed Martin because they had these big monolithic systems, and he had created a modular system.
Right.
And so the government loved it. They had saved money, and but it really scared Lockheed and Raytheon. So they got in a bidding war for his technology. But he said, I do not do group think. He goes, I will go into a meeting with my ideas. And I'm always curious about that, because I read in your book about this concept of having an open meeting structure, but at the same time, how do you get these ideas unless you're solitarily sitting?
Socrates, he used to have a method they call Koinonia back in ancient times, when people who had an intellectual interest would gather, and they would have certain rules when they discussed problems. One rule was everything is fair game. You can say anything you want. There'll be no judgment, and no interruptions. Be quiet and listen. And Einstein, later on in life, he adopted those same rules when he had discussions with other physicists that he respected. They would simply sit and discuss problems, because you start making associations. We live in an age where we believe everything is continuous, linear, logical, analytical. But the universe doesn't operate that way. The universe, the primary principle in the universe is discontinuity. Things are acausal and happen many times by random events. So if you're sitting there thinking about a problem, and somebody comes up with an idea that you hadn't thought about, you might make an association in your mind to something, to some other problem, where that will create a connection that you can use to solve something else. It's like these teachers were sitting around, and they had a problem with the bathroom. The girls were making lipstick smears on the mirror as they played around with different lipsticks. And it was hard for the janitor to clean these mirrors. So they brainstormed, and they came up, we give them an incentive. They tried various things. We'll punish them. They tried that. That didn't work. And then one day they're sitting around, and one of the teachers said, why don't we give them a free piece of pizza if they don't do it? And everybody laughed. And that got this one person thinking, when I was in school, we had this game, what was called gross out, where we tried to gross out somebody else. And one of the things that we used one day was this little pizza shop near the school where everybody went for pizza. We spread the rumor that they were using toilet water to make the pizza, because they had no water coming into the pizza place. And that grossed out all the students, and they stopped going to the pizza place. So she said, grossing out, that's the answer. How can we gross them out? So she thought and came up with the idea. She had all the girls come to the bathroom, and she had the janitor come in. She said, I want the janitor to show you how difficult it is to clean these mirrors from your lipstick. So the janitor picked up his wand and brush, and he goes to a toilet, and he submerges it into the toilet water. Then he comes out and uses the toilet water to clean the mirror. They never had another problem.
Well, I love that story. That is a great story. I think people, and I know myself, where sometimes we get so good at our craft, we get so good at our space of expertise that we think that we are smart and creative, when I think sometimes I get lulled into, I'm just really good at pattern recognition because I happen to understand my space so much.
Right.
Is that, am I calling it correctly? Is that what pattern recognition is versus creativity?
Pattern recognition?
Pattern recognition versus really creative problem solving or ideas.
Well, humans are great pattern recognition, pattern completion machines. The problem is, once we become educated or expert at something, these patterns are very strong in our mind. So whenever we're confronted with a problem, just a tiny amount of information will trigger that pattern, which will lead you to the same old ideas you always come up with. That it's the pattern. You can't will a change in your thinking patterns. It's like me saying to you, the best view of my neighborhood is from the roof. Well, you can't get to the roof by willing yourself up. You need a ladder, a tool. And it's the same thing to provoke different thinking patterns in your mind. You need something, a creative thinking technique to provoke it. And one way to provoke a different thinking pattern is you look at your problem and say, what is the essence of my problem? Like George de Mistral, he wanted to improve the zipper. And he knew if he thought only of zippers, material, position and all that, he would come up with only a minor modification of what they already have. So he thought, how do things fasten in other domains? How does a window fasten? How does a door, how do people fasten their clothes together? And then one day, as he's thinking about how things fasten, he's walking through the field with his dog, and a burdock attaches itself to his pants. And he's fascinated. How did that fasten to my pants? So he takes it home and he studies it, and he sees that a burdock has loops and hooks and attaches itself to anything that comes by that is amenable to being hooked by the hooks, and the burdock is carried away. And so he studies the hook and loop pattern and comes up with a different way to fasten clothes. It has nothing to do with zippers anymore, but he invents Velcro. That's the kind of idea that you can't get if you're using your conventional thinking patterns. He got himself thinking in a different way by thinking of the essence of the problem, how do things fasten, and then looking around the world at how things in other domains, including nature, fasten. Louis Braille was blinded as a small boy. He was helping his father make horse harnesses. And he was sitting around one day, and he loved to read before he was blinded. And he's thinking, how can a blind person read? And he picked up a pine cone, and he's feeling the pine cone as he's wondering how a blind person can read. And he's touching the spears in the pine cone, and he knows they're all of a different length. And then he got his insight. A blind person can read if you raise the letters on a sheet of paper, and invented Braille.
Wow.
But these are the kinds of ideas, you just are not going to get using your conventional thinking patterns. Because when you provoke different thinking patterns using a creative technique like introducing something random into your thinking, like the pine cone, it gives you a different way to focus on your information and a different way to interpret what you're focusing on. There's no way to will that, and that's why Da Vinci, in his notebooks, goes to great lengths about all the various techniques that he uses. And all these creative thinkers go to great lengths to describe how they came up with their ideas. Another technique to use is to think of the assumptions you're making about a problem and reverse all the assumptions. Go to the opposite and try and make the opposite into an idea that's workable. And there's a group of artists in California, they noticed that once an artist becomes famous, they can sell consumer goods with their name. So they said, well, what's the reverse of that? And they said, let's sell consumer goods, and selling the consumer goods will make us into a famous artist. So they formed a little group, and they bought some wallets. Then each one came up with a personal design for 25 wallets. Then they had an exhibition, but they put the wallets out there for sale. The reason they used the wallet was as something you can't hang up on a wall or put away in a desk and nobody ever sees. But a wallet you're exposing to all kinds of people, throughout the day as you pay for things. And other people will begin to notice it. And the selling of the wallets got them the attention they needed for many of them to begin artistic careers.
So you can't will. What you're saying is the WILL. You can't, if you want to create something different for like a zipper, for example, you're saying you can't just focus on that and say, mind, give me a creative idea on zipper. Give me a creative idea. You can't force that. You've actually got to create a brand new association. That's the combinatory element that's critical, correct?
Yeah. It's like, that's what Thinker Toys is. It's a collection of different techniques on how to provoke different thinking patterns. What you mentioned earlier about you can pick up the book and open it anywhere. It makes no difference where. But you can read what's there. It would be a technique that you can use or not use or go to another technique. But you need the technique. You can't simply... This was another myth in school that you sit around thinking about, I want a new idea, and you'll be inspired somehow. Inspiration doesn't work. No one's inspired. The people who create work at becoming creative.
You almost have to make your brain sweat. It's almost like it's analogous. This is how dense your book is. It's almost like taking on physical exercise, except it's physical exercise for your brain.
Sure. And the more times you exercise your brain, the more contacts you make between the neurons in your brain. And the more contacts you make, the more associations you get. And the more associations you get, the more ideas you can generate. Then it becomes harvesting the proliferation of these ideas, and then interacting with the ideas, and then evaluating the ideas to see which ones are practical and worthwhile.
Okay, so I suffer from too many ideas personally, and maybe some people listening will suffer from too little or too many, but I have a challenge where too many ideas are percolating, and I was looking through Thinker Toys and I'm thinking, gosh, how can I sort of govern? And the thing is, I don't want to govern the ideas. I sort of want to I'm wondering where the nuggets are, because obviously most of them are just junk, but some of them may be good. So do I use that murder board technique where I just go into a room and ask people's feedback on all my ideas and let them kind of kill the ones that are bad and good?
Well, there are ways to evaluate the ideas, but I believe it's important to record the ideas and capture them and keep idea journals and notebooks as all the creative geniuses did. Edison left behind 3,500 notebooks describing in detail every idea he ever had. They still haven't gone through all of them. But what I discovered in studying Edison was that whenever he needed a new idea, he would look at something that he had worked at in the past that failed. Like he had worked on the underwater sea cable at one time. And he used the principle of variable resistance, and his idea failed. But he brought that back when he was working on a telephone transmitter and realized that the principle of variable resistance that failed with the underwater cable would work in the telephone transmitter, and it became, the industry standard in telephones. He was a major partner in an iron ore company. It was going bankrupt. He was going to lose a lot of money. So he went through his notebooks, all his idea notebooks, and he came across the work he did on cement. And he realized, my God, the iron ore mine that we have, factory, that's a perfect model for making cement. And they converted it to making Portland cement, and he saved his fortune. And then he would use the notebooks as a springboard for more ideas. One day he was looking at the work he did on the telephone, and he's thinking, sounds transmitted. If they can be transmitted, why can't they be recorded? And invented the phonograph. And then one day he's looking at what he did on a phonograph, sounds recorded, and he said, if sounds can be recorded, why can't pictures be recorded? And invented motion pictures. And the other thing is, when you capture these ideas in writing, interact with them by writing them down, your subconscious mind never stops working. And once you have observed these ideas and recorded them or captured them, these ideas will be combining and recombining in your subconscious mind billions of different ways. And one day you'll be walking down the street and a mind-popping idea will surface out of nowhere. And might be the solution to another problem or a brand new idea, had nothing to do with whatever you were thinking of, but it will simply pop up. And that's where teachers said you get these eureka moments. You get the eureka moments after you stuff your subconscious mind with all your thoughts and ideas over time. And Charles Darwin said he could remember the rock his carriage hit when his theory of evolution fell into perfect place. Einstein said when he was thinking about his theory of relativity one night, he had a fierce headache. He said, it was like I had a storm in my head. I went to sleep. I had nightmares all night. I woke up, and suddenly the theory of relativity was right there. Everything was obviously in front of me. You know, that's your subconscious mind. Bertrand Russell, the great mathematician, said whenever he was confronted with a problem, he would work on it hard for a week or 2 weeks. Then he said if he couldn't get the answer, he would leave it. He'd leave it for a month or 2 months and then come back. And he said invariably it would be solved. Norman Mailer, whenever he was had writer's block, he would write a letter to his unconscious mind, subconscious mind. He would say, dear subconscious, here's where I am on this novel. Here's where I'm stuck. I don't know what to do with this character. How can I relate this character to the major plot? Give me the answer within 3 days. And he would sometimes even mail the letter to himself. And other times he would put it in his desk drawer. Then 3 days later, he'd open the letter and the problem would be solved.
Yeah, it's like this process of incubation that you talked about in the book is what you're talking about is that...
Yeah. That's an important part, but you need something. Something cannot come from nothing. And incubation comes from all these ideas. You said you have all these ideas and thoughts and things, and your problem is you have too many. What you are blessed having all this in your subconscious mind.
Well, I can go on and on and on with questions, but I know we're approaching our hour wrap up, and maybe we can have a round 2 sometime. I just feel that I carry a notebook with me everywhere, and by reading your book, it further spurs me and invigorates me it kind of pushes the concepts of what's possible.
Right.
And to be reminded of these very creative people, because it makes you think about, what could I accomplish? They all had the same amount of time.
Right.
And what can be accomplished. So I thank you for inspiring us with your writing.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Bill.
So there you have it. That was Michael Michalko. I hope you were inspired listening to Michael as I was talking with him and learning from him. And if you did enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave your comments on iTunes. iTunes ranks this show's success and quality by the comments that are left from the listeners, from you. In addition, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Red Zone Technologies. If you are looking for a world-class organization to provide IT security assessment services or alternatives to your IT security managed services, or just looking for expertise and a different approach to IT security, you can go to www.redzonetech.net. So until next time, thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net. www.ecom.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.